So welcome back to the More in Common podcast, part 2 of the Ashwin Chacko conversation. We're super excited to bring this to you. And if you haven't tuned in to part 1, don't forget to check that out before you continue forward. And if you like it, share it, leave us a comment, give us some love, and we'll get to this conversation right now. Because you mentioned something that I'm massively curious to understand your perspective on around sexuality and a fad of it. Like, can you expand? Like, do you actually witness people that you know, like, going towards a popularity of bisexuality or homosexuality? I'm fascinated to understand your lived experience on this.
Not me personally. I'm of the older generation, I suppose, at this stage. So a lot of my friends would have a similar ethos as me. But I see a lot of it happening in schools and social media, like in movies now. There is this, like, if there isn't a person who is LGBTQ ABC within a movie, it's not put forward for awards. It's not put forward for all these other categories, you know? So there is this subtle change that has been continually pushed till now. This is a forefront, and this is now a norm. That's what I've noticed over the last 5 years. You see this happening. You look at every TV show, movie, there'll be at least one that'll turn up. Whereas prior to this, you wouldn't have seen any. And often it doesn't really help or build the story. It's just added in to ensure that all bases are covered, that they're woke or, you know, in key with culture, as it were.
What's your take on that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think sexuality is something that is personal. I don't think it's something that needs to be publicly displayed for everybody. What does it matter? What you do in your own free time, in your own free will, is yours to do. I don't see why people have to put a flag out to say, this is what I do. I mean, does it benefit anybody? What does it do? It just creates a larger border between people. That's what I think.
Larger border in what way?
You're saying I'm different and this is how I am, or like, you know, like it's similar to me, or at least how I perceive it. It's like when vegans came out, you know, like, and the first thing you heard, rather than, hey, my name is blah, blah, and I'm a vegan. Now it's, my name is blah, blah, and I am LGBTQ, whatever. You know, so like, I don't know if it's like, this is what you really are, or this is what you really believe, or this is just what you are doing to feel like this is normal. And if I don't do this, it's not normal. This is where I'm like, does it matter? Does it add to the conversation? Does it change perception on the person? What does it do?
So from your perspective, is it, like, say from a movie standpoint, does it detract from movies having gay characters or LGBTQ characters in the movies? Or like, what's your, is it or for them being up for awards, or like, what's your perspective? You said it's more of a personal thing, but how does it affect the overall, your view of it?
Well, I think if it's key to the story, then yes, 100%. If that was always the intention, then go for it. But don't put it in for the sake of putting it in, you know, where it doesn't actually add to the story. It's just like, okay, we've ticked the bases. The box has been checked. We have one of this, one of this. There's one black person, one Chinese person, one white man, one Indian guy. Okay, we've covered the categories. There's one straight guy, there's one gay guy, there's one lesbian. You know, that's what it's starting to feel like in a lot of these movies, where it's not necessarily a part of the storyline. It doesn't add to it. It's just a detail put in there to tick the box so that you are now eligible for, say, awards, or you're not seen as a homophobe or whatever else.
Do you think it takes away from the story by having all of that? So, like, if you're just telling a normal story and you've just got diversity in the cast, regardless, do you think it takes away from the story?
If not necessarily. Yeah, so I don't think it really depends on what's being told, right? Does it add to it, or is it just there for the sake of being there?
Would you argue?
What do you mean by does it add to it?
Yeah.
I have a example, but I have a, what do you mean by adding to?
So, like, you know, in a lot of stories, there's a key defining arc, right? The character is going through certain things. He meets a mentor. He has
Hero's
a problem
journey
that needs to be solved. You know, he goes through that whole process. But this is often, these added scenes are just there. They're fillers. They're not adding to the main story. They don't add to the hero's journey necessarily. They're just chucked in between to fill gaps, fill spaces. It's like in a comic book. Like, I'm a big comic head nerd. So, like, you know, you have the main panels, right? And then the space in between is called the gutter. And the gutter is the stuff that happens in between that isn't necessarily important to the main story, but it does happen in life, you know? So it doesn't drive the story, but it's just there.
Do you think then I would ask, and this is just out of curiosity, that, like, on that same story arc, on that same, if a wife is thrown into the mix, that doesn't really materially add to the storyline other than to reflect that this main male character is married to a woman and has 2 kids. Maybe that adds to the tension, but maybe it doesn't add anything. Would you argue that that adds no value to the discussion as well?
Yeah, like, if it's done in the same way the other ones are done, then I'd say yes. It doesn't really matter then. Like, for instance, if you look at Lord of the Rings, right? You've got the heroes. You've got a key story. There's a key adventure that's happening. We don't go into, like, Bilbo's love life or Frodo's love life or Sam's love life. It's focused on the story being told, right? Those other things would not add to the story. They don't build into it. So it's not told.
So I think I'm getting to a place where I'm understanding where you're coming from. When you watch film or read a story or whatever, do you just generally not like all of that extra stuff? You just like the storyline to almost have its story arc without extra things, unless it adds to the climax. Like, you've got Bilbo and you've got Sam, and they're friends, and that friendship eventually matters to the story arc. So therefore it's relevant to the story, and that's just, you just prefer that. You know, if it were a romantic relationship, it wouldn't matter, because as long as it, like, adds to the tension of that climax moment, like, that's what you're looking for when you watch a film.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, like, the whole point of a story is you're communicating something, whether you like it or not. That's why we tell stories, right? You're trying to communicate something. And so if at the end of the story you haven't communicated what you were trying to communicate, the story loses its potential, its power, everything it was designed for, right? So like, even with any great movie, even though we want to be entertained, at the end of it, the best movies, or the movies that we remember, are the ones that had a clear message. They had a takeaway in some way or form. And you relate to the character, you relate to, the message, you relate to the deeper ethos of like what that story was truly about. I mean, it's something that we as humans fundamentally do, right? We tell stories so that we can shape our lives, whether that is, for instance, if we see a potential future, we start telling ourselves the story of where we want to see ourselves. People who are trapped in the past tell themselves the story of how great their glory day was. So like, we're constantly in this ethos of telling stories, right? And so this is why it really matters, whether, at least to me, why it matters that a story communicates what it's meant to communicate.
So if it were an interracial gay couple that is portraying the reflection of the struggle of being an interracial gay couple in Western society, especially in, Southern Christian town, and how they got, like, you're game for that. It's the fluff of just throwing characters in because you care about, as you put it, how. Well, and I say this, because the way it starts off, there's a lot of assumptions that can be made. Like, what, do you not like gay people? Do you have a problem with gay people? Right. And so understanding the motives, and like, I'm calling this out in the moment to understand where you were coming from and what you were portraying, because I know as even a listener, it's like, oh, this guy, like, oh, what's this guy trying to say, right? Because I do think at the same time, there is value in it. I get it from an artistic, pure film perspective, and I'm curious to get your thought too, Rodney. There's value in it from a traditional, I don't usually see myself at all in any film, but at the same time, there's also a devalue in it if you're just throwing in a stereotypical character just to fill a role, and then all of a sudden I'm seeing myself, but that's not really who I am, yet that's the only one of me in this entire film, right? So there can be a detraction. Rodney, I don't know if you had some thought.
Maybe, but I'll let Ashwin respond to you if he.
Yeah, agreed. Like, I have no problem with gay people. I love you guys. You be you, and I'll be me, and that's how it's gonna be. But like, I'm just talking about like society in general and culture. We shouldn't be forcing perceptions of like, this is how things should be, or this is what everybody should be. They talk about like giving everybody equal choice, but then if you say, I don't believe this, suddenly it's like, oh, you're in opposition, but you're not necessarily in opposition. It's just a choice not to do what you want to do, right? So it has to be a two-way conversation. You can't say, allow me to do what I want to do, but then you have to believe what I believe as well, because then you're taking the other person's choice away. So if we're going to talk about choice, if we're going to talk about like equality, it's got to be equal on both sides.
Which historically we people are not good at. I think that's what I was trying to say with the earlier conversation. Like the predominant message is usually set out by a certain part of society. So it's now no, it's a fascinating conversation, and it kind of gets me to thinking about who gets to, like, all the different inputs to what's culture, what's normal, what's not, and then how are those all weighted, and then all of that's going to vary on so many different factors. Like, I personally don't take my idea of culture from film and media, but then a lot of people do. So it's like, well, where is it weighted and all of that? So it's no, it's a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and it reminds me of and I think I pick up the macro point there. It reminds me of the nexus of Rodney and my friendship. And I've said this to Rodney for a long time. Rodney had a more religious background, so he came into our friendship with a more conservative viewpoint on certain things. And I never once felt as if he was pushing that sort of agenda on me, right? And he was never trying to get me to believe in God or go to church or do all of these things and be anti-gay or be all of these things. We could just have a conversation about it without judgment of either each other or other people, right? Like, I think that's where we lose that common culture, where that friction comes in. And this is where ego plays a huge role, right? Is I don't believe it to be true, so you can't be it. And homosexuality is a great example, right? It's like, if I don't agree with homosexuality, then you can't be gay. And we've had this conversation a lot.
I mean, it's a lot of people will even say, I don't understand it, therefore it can't be.
And then it can't be a thing, versus I don't agree with it. Cool. But that just means even if in my bones I'm gay and I feel it and I want men and I just fight every instinct of my life because I don't believe in it, that's my choice for me. Whatever that's going to cause, it absolutely becomes danger when I say to you, you can't be it. And I think there is to your point, Rodney, who defines the culture, right? And that's the historical challenge. We've always had someone trying to tell someone else what the culture has to be, versus finding a higher level entity of what culture should be, so we can all be ourselves within it without judging of other people. That's kind of what I've picked up from what you were saying, Ashwin. Would you disagree or argue with me on any of that?
No, I 100% agree. You know, it is about keeping an open mind. It's about, like, you know, one of the most spiritual things that you can do is making choices. You know, we all make choices every single day. Okay, you choose what toothpaste, you choose how you look, how you dress. I mean, look as in like how you style yourself. You choose how you interact with people. Every day, everything about humanity is about choices, right? And so the moment you start limiting a person's choices, that's when you start having this tension and this fighting. And then the other thing is, yes, we all have choices, but the flip side of it is then taking responsibility for those choices. So you can't just say, I want to make all these choices, but then not be responsible for the actions I've taken. You know, this is like the fundamental problem. We all want to blame somebody else. Yeah, so we need to take responsibility for our choices, right? Because this is the fundamental problem that we all have. We want to blame other people for our circumstances, but we have the ability to take ourselves out of the situation we're in through the choices we make. So, like, for instance, if I grow up poor, I still have the potential of going far. It just comes down to the mindset and the choice I take to move myself from point A to point B. But you have to be motivated, and you have to be able to look past your circumstances to the greater potential.
Do you think, Ashwin, like at an aspirational, like idealistic point of view, that with that being said, that circumstances still can significantly limit someone's ability, and that idealistically we should all at least have the same starting line? In other words, those who define our culture define it such that there's inequality, right? And that's just historical. That's the nature of things. Whereas my argument would be we should be defining our culture that we have economically, you know, those are things that, you know, we can parse out. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be making it harder for other people with racist policies or bigoted behavior or treating people so poorly because of their differences that it does make their circumstance so much harder that even with the most powerful mindset, it just becomes exhausting.
Yeah. I'd agree that we shouldn't make it harder with such policies, obviously. And yes, there should be a greater understanding of like, or an equal platform, or an understanding of all people are equal from a governance standpoint, you know. But it becomes very hard to then define, or who defines where the equal plateau is at this stage, you know. How do you start saying, oh, this is fair for this person, whereas it's not fair for this person, you know? Because then it can start flipping the other way around. And now, until this point, the white man has been on top, but now it's like everybody else is on top and he's at the bottom. So it shouldn't go to the level where that truly happens. It should be an even playing field if you're going to do it, right? So that's how I would think about it.
Yeah, I think the probably the easiest way to consider all points, I mean, to that last point, is like having more people at the table that are making the decisions. Because it's real hard. It's not only real hard, but I think it goes against like some basic human survival mechanism to like make a decision that would benefit you but possibly hurt me if I don't see you as me, if I don't see you as the same as me, or believing the same as me, or all those things that we've been talking about, like the being open to what's different, which is what's happened when everybody who's at the table is the same. You know, then they can just make rules and who cares what everybody else thinks. This is common culture.
Now, do you really think the white man's on the bottom now?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
Let's put that out there.
No. I don't. I'm just saying, like, you're starting to see this trend
like
of like
1A,
you know,
not like 1A.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, like, this is the way it's trending, and if it continues to trend that way for the next 10, 20 years, you're going to see a similar like flip on the switch. It starts in the same way. Like, a lot of these things start from a good place, but then as time shifts, you know, what felt good back then suddenly time has changed, people have changed, and they don't know the reason why that policy was put in place originally, right? And then you get to this stage 20, 30, 40 years later, and the person who set the policy here, those people have now gone to a higher level. But then the other people who were originally on the top are now somewhere else, right? And so it's a question of time.
Well, time and governance. I mean, you've got here in the States, constitutionalists who are like, no, it was written like that and it should stay like that. And then there's people who say, well, we should take a look at it, maybe update it for how we live now in a world that's a little different than 1700s. But not everybody, everybody's ideology on that is different as well.
Well, there are some fundamental rules that don't change, like you don't kill people. That's something that everybody can agree on, and so you have you have these certain laws that should be foundational, and then everything else comes down to a flex in culture, like, because what is culturally acceptable switches from generation to generation. You just think about like short shorts, right? That used to be a big problem for girls in India, especially when we were growing up. No girls would be wearing short shorts, but now they're everywhere, and it's culturally acceptable. But before, it would be like, she's a slut because she's wearing short shorts, So the culture starts shifting, and
it's one of those things that we've talked about in corporate diversity and inclusion efforts that, it is that balance culturally and socially to it almost feels like to raise, we have to pull down, right? And because we got to get to equity faster. And oftentimes, we don't talk about white people in diversity and inclusion because, that completes the diversity circle. So it's this fine balance, because at the end of the day, much of all of Western society that has grown up in Europe and, the United States, Canada, and everywhere else, has been anchored on white men colonizing other countries, right? And like making that shift that is older than time, it feels, is so hard, and there's so much conflict in it, right? There's so much resistance, especially if you're comfortable and used to it. And it is a fascinating conversation around how we look at, define, and work towards a more equitable culture.
I have to say, like, I don't think we should pull other people down. If anything, they should pull other people up. Like, as soon as you start pulling people down, that will start having a detrimental effect on society as a whole. Whereas if you're already at a platform, you pull them up to the platform, not the other way around, because then the bottom line stays the bottom line. Whereas if you start pulling them up, then the bottom line starts rising with the people.
Rising tide. Right, exactly. And the top line can grow and can expand.
Yeah. And it's about getting to see people.
That's where a lot of the work is showing people that the top line can grow and more people can stand there, versus being like, oh, well, it's actually only limited, so only a couple people can stand here, so the rest of you have to be down there.
Yeah. That's again a mentality thing, like that there's limited, there's a limit of the space or of the resources of everything. There is actually infinite amounts, and infinite amounts can be created. But it's this mindset that we have of I call it the pauper mindset, where you always are constantly looking and believing that there isn't enough, versus a mindset of abundance, that there is so much potential and you can grow to that stage.
So first I want to say thank you for indulging this conversation, as you have. I don't think any of us expected to go in this direction today, which is fantastic, and it's what we're all about. My question before we start wrapping up is, as we're talking about culture, one of your big things is having your art influence and shape people. How do you do that? What is it that you do with your art, and what goal are you trying to accomplish with that?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, if you look throughout history, art is what defines the culture. It'll be the crowning glory of that culture. If you look at the Renaissance, how is it defined? It's by the art that was left behind. If you look at the Dark Ages, Baroque, it's the architecture, the art, that these are the defining principles of the culture. And so in my day and age as an artist, my call is to then help shape the culture for a better. And so with everything I do, every piece of art that I create, my deeper goal is to bring joy and encouragement to the people around me. So that's the why that drives me every day.
Good. It's actually how'd you say it? The crowning accomplishment, and it's often the lasting legacy, like Baroque, like all these terms that come out of those different eras. That's how we tend to refer back to or remember many of them. That's interesting. I never really thought about that.
Yeah, you look at. I was talking with my wife about this the other day. Just culturally, our relationship with sexuality and sex. You look at the Italians, and you look at the sculptures that are around, right? They have a more comfortable association versus the United States, where anything displayed is really, this is changing now, but it's really very hidden. It's secretive. It's almost shameful in many ways. And you see that dispersed throughout. And you can really see that in the reflection of the art. You could tie a cultural's perception of sex and sexuality based on their art very directly.
There's just because you're talking about that, an interesting thing is in India, where I'm originally from, there is a lot of sexuality in all the temples and all the artifacts over the last century or more. But it's a very taboo topic in India. You cannot talk about sex. It's like behind hidden doors that you have a conversation about it, which has detrimental effects on educating people as well on, basic acts and that sort of thing. So it's a weird, shift over time and space where it went from one thing to the complete opposite on the other spectrum.
Yeah. Now, is the art in India, is it in your face, or do you have to take a close look to see where it's portrayed all over the place?
Well, some temples have it all over. It's like the Kama Sutra, right?
Oh,
on the temples.
Yeah.
It's not vulgar. It's just,
sure.
It's
not shameful. It's not hidden, which is very interesting. As you mentioned.
What about Ireland?
I don't think I've seen anything around. Again, it has a different foundation. Again, it started pagan, but it has a huge Christian influence over the last century or so.
Yeah.
Well,
so,
Ashwin, this has been a great conversation. I hope you're feeling cool.
I'm glad we got to have it.
I'm glad we got to have it. I'm glad we got it through, I know it's
The
late
airwaves
there.
tried to
so
stop us.
great way to
Thank you. No,
great way
thank you.
to
Like
end the
walking
night.
through how you just letting us ask you some questions and get to understand how you think a little bit more and getting into some deep topics and heavy topics. It was good.
Because I will
Yeah.
say, like, your perspective of movies and the story and art, like, there's such a subjective component to it, like purists and people who just really, whereas I'm like, not that at all. So anytime someone can be represented in a movie that maybe hasn't been historically, and it's fine, like, it doesn't detract from the plot, it just is part of it, I'm like, cool, right? But I don't look at it the same way, and I think there's just the art itself. So I love the nuance and the getting to have this conversation with you. So thank you.
It really highlights that it's important. Like the initial statement or somebody's view is important, but understanding where they're coming from, like how you watch movies or how you look at art, is different than how I look at art, and how different than how Keith looks at art. So, but if we wouldn't have continued on that conversation, would have had no clue how you were looking at it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, listening.
Listening
for
and asking questions.
Throughout this whole conversation, I think like this key principle that I try to live by is love your neighbor as yourself. And if we all applied that across all the concepts we spoke about, you know, like how you treat other people, if we start applying that on a daily life, it solves a lot of problems. You talk about equality, you talk about, you know, race, you talk about sexuality. Treat people the way you want to be treated, and we're all going to be good. But again, I'm a bit of an idealist there. So,
Well, you kind of answered our last question. We had one more.
yeah, I'll ask it just in case you want to add. But the last question is, what does compassion mean to you?
it's putting others before yourself. You know, it's having grace. It's having empathy. It's being willing to feel a little uncomfortable to make sure that the other person is lifted out of their situation.